The storm that drove Juan Boone to Leora Prescott's cabin door wasn't just wind and rain. It was fate disguised as weather, carrying a lonely drifter to a woman who'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone care whether she lived or died. Some arrivals change everything, even when they start with nothing more than a request for warm coffee and dry shelter. Leora had been alone on her Montana homestead for nearly a year, tending chickens and fixing what broke with the stubborn determination of someone who'd learned that survival meant never depending on others. At 24, she'd grown comfortable with solitude, but comfort wasn't the same as contentment, and winter nights had taught her the difference between being alone and being lonely. But what began with shared stew and cautious conversation would become the kind of love story that proved the best things in life were worth waiting for, built slowly through quiet moments and gentle touches that honored both the woman who'd never been kissed and the man patient enough to let her learn what love could be. Montana Territory in the spring of 1883 was a place where neighbors might live 20 miles apart, and where a woman alone on a homestead faced challenges that went far beyond the practical difficulties of farming and livestock management. The land was beautiful but unforgiving, demanding constant vigilance and hard work from anyone who hoped to make it productive. Leora's homestead sat in a valley where her father had believed the soil and water access would support a thriving farm. But his death had left her to manage alone what had been designed as a two-person operation. The nearest town was a day's ride away, close enough for necessary supplies, but far enough that social interaction required deliberate planning rather than casual occurrence. This isolation created both vulnerability and independence. Women like Leora learned to handle problems themselves because help might not arrive in time to matter, but they also developed strength and competence that impressed men accustomed to more dependent partners. Leora's childhood had been shaped by her father's unwavering belief that land ownership represented true security and independence. James Prescott had brought his daughter west after her mother's death, determined to build something lasting that would provide for Leora's future even if he wasn't there to protect her. He'd taught her everything he knew about farming, animal husbandry, and frontier survival, treating her as the son he'd never had while ensuring she understood that her gender would make her life more difficult but not impossible. His sudden death from a heart attack had left her with valuable skills, but also with the crushing responsibility of proving she could maintain what they'd built together. The year since her father's death had been a test of everything he'd taught her, and while Leora had managed to keep the homestead functioning, she'd done so at the cost of almost all social interaction and personal happiness. Her days were filled with necessary tasks that left little time for reflection or planning beyond immediate survival needs. The loneliness was a constant companion that she'd learned to push aside during daylight hours, but evening meals eaten in silence and nights spent listening to empty rooms had begun to wear on her spirit in ways that hard work couldn't heal. What made Leora remarkable wasn't just her practical competence, though her ability to manage a homestead alone impressed everyone who knew her circumstances. It was her capacity for hope despite isolation, her willingness to remain open to possibilities even when experience had taught her that most people would disappoint or abandon her. She'd maintained her father's belief that good things came to those who worked hard and treated others fairly. But she'd also developed the kind of cautious optimism that protected her from devastation while allowing her to recognize genuine kindness when it appeared unexpectedly at her door. Juan's arrival at Leora's homestead represented more than just an interruption of her solitary routine. It was a test of everything she'd learned about trusting others and risking the security she'd fought so hard to maintain. Her year of independence had proven she could survive alone, but it had also revealed the emotional cost of that survival. The choice between continued self-reliance and the vulnerability required for companionship carried risks that went beyond practical considerations. For Juan, Leora's homestead offered something he'd been searching for without realizing it, not just shelter from a storm, but refuge from the restless wandering that had defined his life since the war. His experience with loss had taught him to avoid attachments that could be taken away, but it had also left him hungry for the kind of connection that could only be built through patience and genuine care. The central tension wasn't whether they would be attracted to each other, but whether they could overcome their respective fears and histories enough to build something lasting together. Both carried wounds that made love seem dangerous, but both also possessed the strength and wisdom to heal those wounds if they chose to try. But as Juan settled into Leora's barn for what should have been one night of shelter, neither of them realized they were about to discover that the most beautiful love stories begin not with passion, but with patience, not with promises, but with presence. The decision to let a stranger shelter in her barn should have been simple, for Leora basic frontier hospitality demanded nothing less, especially during a storm that could kill a man caught in the open. But something about Juan Boone's quiet courtesy and respectful demeanor suggested he was different from the drifters and fortune-seekers who occasionally passed through her valley. His request for shelter came with offers to help with chores. His presence in her kitchen was careful rather than presumptuous, and his obvious effort to maintain appropriate distance showed understanding of her vulnerable position. What transformed hospitality into something more was the way Juan noticed things that needed attention around the homestead and addressed them without being asked. The chicken coop roof that had been leaking since winter, the snares that could be improved to catch more game, the dozen small repairs that she'd been managing alone. He approached these tasks with the competence of someone who understood frontier life and the consideration of someone who wanted to repay kindness with practical help. By the third day, Leora found herself looking forward to their evening conversations over coffee, enjoying the sound of another voice in rooms that had been silent too long. Juan's stories of his travels, his observations about the land and weather, his gentle questions about her father, and the homestead's history all created connection without pressure, companionship without expectation. For the first time in a year, she wasn't just surviving, but actually enjoying her daily routine. The conversation that changed everything came on the fourth evening, when spring rain drummed against the cabin walls, and they sat by the fire sharing coffee that had become their ritual of quiet companionship. Leora's admission that she'd never been kissed emerged from a discussion about loneliness and connection, spoken with the kind of honesty that only comes when someone feels truly safe with another person. Juan's response, taking off his hat and suggesting they start slow, revealed everything about his character and intentions. He didn't see her inexperience as something to exploit or overcome quickly, but as something precious that deserved patience and respect. His understanding that intimacy couldn't be rushed, that trust had to be built gradually through consistent care and attention, showed wisdom that came from genuine maturity rather than just experience. The planning that followed wasn't strategic in any calculated sense, but rather the natural development of two people who decided to explore what might be possible between them. Juan's continued help around the homestead began to feel less like temporary assistance and more like partnership. Leora's increasing comfort with his presence, her willingness to share stories about her father, and her fears about managing alone created emotional intimacy that paralleled their growing physical awareness of each other. Their visit to the wild plum grove became a turning point where they could acknowledge mutual attraction while maintaining the careful pace that honored both their needs. The setting itself, beautiful natural away from the homestead's practical demands, allowed them to see each other as people rather than just partners in survival, to imagine possibilities beyond immediate needs and daily routines. The kiss they shared among the plum blossoms was everything Leora's first kiss should have been: gentle, patient, meaningful, rather than passionate, offered rather than taken. Juan's care in making sure she felt safe and respected transformed what could have been awkward or overwhelming into something beautiful that she could treasure rather than regret. But more important than the physical intimacy was the emotional honesty that surrounded it. Their discussion of past hurts, Juan's loss of his brother in the war, Leora's grief over her father's death, and her fear of being abandoned again, created understanding that went deeper than attraction. They weren't just two lonely people finding comfort in each other. They were two wounded souls recognizing the possibility of healing together. The commitment they made wasn't to marriage or permanent partnership, but to taking things one day at a time, allowing their relationship to develop naturally, without pressure or expectations that might damage what they were building. This patience became the foundation of everything that followed, proving that the strongest connections are often those that grow slowly through consistent care, rather than being forced by passion or desperation. Juan's decision to stay beyond the storm to help with spring planting and homestead improvements signaled intentions that went beyond temporary companionship. But his careful respect for Leora's autonomy and comfort level ensured that his presence enhanced rather than threatened the independence she'd worked so hard to maintain. Because building love slowly meant building it to last, and as spring turned to summer on their Montana homestead, Juan and Leora were about to discover that the most beautiful relationships are those that grow like gardens, carefully tended, patiently nurtured, and given time to flourish naturally. The first challenge came with the practical question of living arrangements as their relationship deepened, but their commitment remained undefined. Juan's continued residence in the barn while helping with daily homestead tasks created a situation that was emotionally intimate but physically separate, satisfying for their careful courtship, but increasingly awkward as their feelings grew stronger. The frontier community's expectations about unmarried men and women living on the same property added external pressure to resolve their status, while their own desires for closer companionship conflicted with their determination not to rush into commitments they might later regret. Finding the right balance between propriety and authenticity required constant negotiation and mutual respect. The second challenge emerged when they began making long-term plans for homestead improvements that assumed Juan's permanent presence. His suggestions for irrigation systems, expanded livestock facilities, and structural additions to the cabin represented investments of time and resources that only made sense if they were building a life together. But discussing these plans forced them to address questions about marriage, legal partnership, and the formal commitments they'd been avoiding. The tension between practical necessity and emotional readiness created moments of uncertainty, where both wondered whether they were moving too fast or not fast enough to secure the future they both wanted. The third escalation came when they attended their first social event together, a barn dance in the nearest town that marked their public appearance as a couple. The community's reaction, approval, curiosity, and some protective concern for Leora made their relationship official in ways that private intimacy hadn't. But public recognition also brought expectations and assumptions about their intentions that they weren't necessarily ready to fulfill. The pressure to announce engagement plans or marriage dates forced them to articulate their commitment to each other while maintaining their preference for proceeding at their own pace rather than society's timeline. The pressure intensified when well-meaning neighbors began offering advice about their relationship with older women, warning Leora about the dangers of keeping company without formal engagement, and men questioning Juan's intentions toward a woman who'd been managing alone successfully. The frontier community's protective attitude toward Leora was understandable given her vulnerable position, but it also created scrutiny that made their careful courtship feel like a public performance rather than a private journey. More challenging was the economic pressure created by the homestead's needs and their uncertain partnership status. Major improvements required significant investment of labor and resources, but undertaking such projects without clear legal commitments risked substantial losses if their relationship didn't work out. The practical demands of frontier life didn't accommodate the luxury of extended courtship, creating tension between their emotional needs and economic realities. The seasonal pressures of farming and ranching added another layer of complexity, as critical tasks like harvest and winter preparation couldn't be delayed while they figured out their personal relationship. Their interdependence for practical survival sometimes made their emotional connection feel obligatory rather than chosen, requiring constant effort to maintain the voluntary nature of their partnership despite their increasing reliance on each other's labor and support. The challenges of building their relationship while managing external pressures transformed both Juan and Leora in ways that strengthened their individual characters while preparing them for successful partnership. Leora discovered that accepting help and companionship didn't diminish her hard-won independence, but enhanced it, allowing her to accomplish more while enjoying the process of shared work and shared goals. Juan learned that commitment didn't have to mean losing the freedom that had defined his post-war wandering. Instead, choosing to build something lasting with someone he respected and cared for provided a different kind of freedom, the liberty to invest in long-term dreams rather than just short-term survival to create, rather than just endure to belong somewhere that felt like home rather than just temporary shelter. Their communication skills developed through the necessity of coordinating complex tasks while respecting each other's autonomy and preferences. They learned to discuss problems honestly without creating conflict, to make decisions together without losing individual identity and to support each other's goals while maintaining personal integrity and values. Most importantly, they developed trust that went beyond romantic attraction or practical convenience. The daily evidence of each other's character competence and commitment created confidence that their partnership could weather difficulties and disagreements while growing stronger rather than more fragile over time. The warning signs of approaching decisions appeared gradually like distant storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. Juan's restlessness during late summer, his comments about friends in other territories and opportunities he'd heard about through traveling traders suggested that his wandering nature hadn't been completely settled by their relationship. Leora's defensive reactions to these mentions revealed her own fears about abandonment and her uncertainty about whether their connection was strong enough to overcome his habitual mobility. The homestead's increasing prosperity created its own pressures as success attracted attention from neighbors who might be interested in purchasing or partnerships that could complicate their current arrangement. Questions about inheritance, legal ownership, and formal marriage began to require answers that couldn't be postponed indefinitely without risking the security they'd built together. Most significantly, their growing intimacy and emotional dependence made them both vulnerable in ways they'd spent years learning to avoid. The possibility of loss through choice circumstance or simply the natural changes that time brought to all relationships threatened to undermine the careful balance they'd achieved between connection and self-protection. The approaching winter represented both practical and symbolic challenges that would test whether their partnership was strong enough to survive the isolation, close quarters, and resource limitations that defined frontier winters, while also determining whether their love could deepen into permanent commitment or would prove to be a beautiful but temporary chapter in their individual journeys. Because as autumn approached their Montana Valley with its promise of long winters and testing times, Juan and Leora were about to discover whether love built slowly and carefully could weather the storms that destroyed relationships based on passion alone. The crisis came not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet words that shattered the careful peace they'd built together. On a crisp September evening, as they worked side by side, preparing the root cellar for winter storage, Juan mentioned casually that he'd received word from an old Army friend about opportunities in Oregon Territory. Good land available for homesteading communities being established where his skills would be valued, the chance to start fresh in country that hadn't already been claimed or scarred by war. What made his words devastating wasn't their content, but their tone, the wistful longing that suggested he was genuinely tempted by the possibility of moving on, of returning to the wandering life that had defined him before he'd found sanctuary in Leora's valley. The careful way he avoided looking at her while he spoke revealed that he'd been thinking about this for weeks, maybe months, without sharing his restlessness or giving her the chance to address whatever was driving his renewed desire to leave. Leora's response was controlled, but cutting, her voice carrying the hurt of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment, but had dared to hope this time might be different. "I wondered when this would happen," she said quietly, continuing to sort potatoes with steady hands that belied the chaos in her heart. "I wondered when you'd start looking toward the horizon again instead of at what we've built here. I suppose I should be grateful. You lasted longer than most drifters do." The accusation implicit in her words that he was just another restless man who would ultimately choose freedom over responsibility, adventure over commitment, hit Juan like a physical blow. He understood suddenly how his casual mention of Oregon had sounded to a woman who had been abandoned by death and now feared abandonment by choice. But his defensive reaction only made things worse. His attempt to explain that he wasn't necessarily planning to leave, just exploring possibilities, sounding like the kind of hollow reassurance that preceded inevitable betrayal. The argument that followed was all the more painful for being conducted in whispers, both of them unwilling to give voice to the accusations and fears that had been building beneath their careful courtesy. Leora's controlled fury revealed how much she'd invested in their relationship despite her determination to protect herself from exactly this kind of heartbreak. Juan's confused defensiveness showed that he hadn't fully understood his own motivations or the implications of his restlessness for the woman who'd come to depend on his presence. "What did you think would happen?" Leora asked, her voice barely audible, but carrying the weight of months of suppressed vulnerability. "Did you think I would just accept that you might leave whenever something better came along? Did you think I could build a life around someone who still talks about other places like they're calling his name?" Her words revealed the fundamental incompatibility between his lingering wanderlust and her need for security, the impossible tension between his nature and her requirements for love. Juan's attempt to reassure her only deepened the crisis. "I'm not planning to leave," he said, but the words sounded weak, even to him. Sometimes I wonder what else is out there, what we might be missing by staying in one place. That doesn't mean I want to go." But his inability to commit definitively to staying, his need to keep options open even when discussing their shared future, proved to Leora that her fears were justified. The moment of truth came when she asked the question that demanded an honest answer. "Can you promise me you'll stay? Not just for this winter or next year, but for as long as it takes to build something lasting together. Can you choose this life, this place, this relationship over all the possibilities you might be giving up?" The silence that followed her question lasted forever, filled with Juan's internal struggle between honesty and kindness, between his genuine love for her and his equally genuine uncertainty about permanent commitment. Juan's answer, when it finally came, was both more honest and more devastating than Leora had expected. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion and self-recognition. "I want to promise you that, but I've never stayed anywhere long enough to know if I can. The war changed something in me, made it hard to believe that anything good can last, made it seem safer to keep moving than to risk losing something I care about." The confession revealed depths of damage that their careful courtship had only begun to address. Juan's wandering wasn't just restlessness or adventure-seeking, it was a trauma response, a way of avoiding the vulnerability that came with permanent attachments. His inability to promise to stay wasn't cruelty, but honesty about wounds that hadn't healed despite months of Leora's patient love. But honesty, however courageous, couldn't resolve their fundamental incompatibility. Leora's need for security wasn't neurotic or unreasonable. It was the natural requirement of someone who'd already lost too much to risk casual abandonment. Her response to his confession was equally honest and equally painful. "Then you should go," she said quietly. "Not because I don't love you, but because I can't live with someone who's always looking for the door. I've built something here that I'm proud of, and I won't let anyone, not even you, make me feel like it's not enough. The decision to separate wasn't made in anger, but in recognition that their needs were incompatible, despite their genuine care for each other. Sometimes, love wasn't enough to overcome fundamental differences in what people needed from life and relationships. But as Juan prepared to leave the valley that had become more like home than anywhere he'd lived since the war, both he and Leora were about to discover that the deepest truths about love and commitment sometimes only become clear when you're on the verge of losing them forever. The 3 days that followed their devastating conversation were filled with the mechanical tasks of separation. Juan packing his few possessions, settling accounts for work he'd done around the homestead, making arrangements to ensure Leora would have help with tasks that required more than one person. The practical details of their parting were handled with the same careful courtesy that had characterized their entire relationship, but beneath the surface civility lay grief that neither wanted to acknowledge. Leora threw herself into preparations for winter with the desperate energy of someone trying to outrun heartbreak. She checked and rechecked her stores of food and fuel-repaired equipment that was already in good condition and planned projects that would keep her busy during the long months of isolation ahead. The homestead that had felt warm and alive with Juan's presence began to feel empty again, but she was determined to prove to herself that she could manage alone just as she had before he arrived. Juan's preparations were more complex, involving not just physical packing, but emotional reckoning, with choices he wasn't sure he wanted to make. His friend's letter about Oregon opportunities remained unanswered on the kitchen table, a symbol of possibilities that seemed less appealing now that they'd become real rather than theoretical. The wandering life that had once represented freedom now felt like exile from the only place where he'd found genuine peace and purpose. The tension between them was almost unbearable, filled with words they couldn't say and feelings they couldn't resolve. Both were suffering, but neither could find a way to bridge the gap between her need for commitment and his inability to promise what she deserved. The breaking point came on Juan's final morning when autumn frost painted the valley in silver and reminded them both of the winter that Leora would face alone. As he loaded his horse and prepared for a departure that neither of them wanted but both believed was necessary, the weight of unspoken regret became impossible to bear. Leora emerged from the cabin with coffee and breakfast that she'd prepared despite having no appetite herself, her gesture of care automatic even in the midst of heartbreak. The sight of her trying to maintain normal routines while her world collapsed around her destroyed what remained of Juan's composure. He understood suddenly that his inability to commit wasn't protecting either of them from pain. It was guaranteeing that pain while preventing the joy that might have made it worthwhile. "This is wrong," he said quietly, setting down his coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly. "Everything about this feels wrong. I'm leaving the only place I've ever felt at home, and you're staying alone in a valley that we could have filled with life and laughter and the kind of love that makes all the risks worthwhile." His voice carried the weight of recognition that came too late to prevent their separation, but not too late to acknowledge its tragedy. Leora's response revealed the depth of her own struggle with their decision. "Wrong doesn't make it impossible," she said, her voice steady despite the tears she couldn't hide. Wanting something doesn't mean you can have it, and loving someone doesn't mean you can live with them. We tried one. We tried to build something beautiful together, and for a while we succeeded. Maybe that has to be enough. The moment that changed everything came when Juan mounted his horse and looked back at the homestead they'd improved together. The repaired buildings, the expanded gardens, the careful improvements that represented months of shared labor and planning. But more than the physical changes, he saw the life they'd built together, the routine of shared meals and quiet conversations, the comfortable silence of two people who'd learned to work as partners rather than just individuals sharing space. "I can't do this," he said suddenly, dismounting with the decisive movement of someone who'd finally understood what he was about to lose. "I can't ride away from the best thing that's ever happened to me because I'm afraid it might not last forever. Everything ends eventually, Leora, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't build beautiful things while we can." His words carried the weight of genuine revelation rather than desperate attempt to avoid leaving. He'd finally understood that his wandering hadn't been about freedom, but about fear, and that real courage meant choosing to stay and build something lasting rather than running away to protect himself from potential loss. Leora's reaction was complicated by hope and skepticism warring in her heart. She wanted to believe his change of heart was genuine, but she'd protected herself for too long to simply accept promises made in the emotion of departure. "Pretty words are easy when you're afraid to leave," she said, her voice carrying the caution of someone who'd learned that love required more than romantic declarations to survive frontier realities. "What happens next winter when you start feeling restless again? What happens when another letter comes from another friend in another territory, offering new opportunities? How do I know this isn't just fear of loneliness? Talking instead of genuine commitment to building a life together." Her questions revealed the practical wisdom that had sustained her through a year of solitude and the emotional intelligence that recognized the difference between temporary sentiment and lasting change. Juan's response required more than words. It demanded actions that proved his transformation was real rather than convenient. He unsaddled his horse completely, carried his belongings back into the cabin, and sat down at the kitchen table where the Oregon letter still waited. Without hesitation, he tore the letter into pieces and threw them into the fire, watching his backup plan turn to ash, while Leora watched in amazement. "I don't want to promise you I'll never feel restless again," Juan said, his honesty more reassuring than any romantic declaration could have been. "I don't want to promise that building a life together will always be easy, or that I'll never wonder about roads I didn't take. But I can promise that I choose this place, this life we're building together over all the possibilities I might be giving up." The distinction between promising perfection and promising commitment was crucial to Leora's ability to trust his decision. She didn't need him to become someone different. She needed him to choose their relationship consistently, even when other options presented themselves. His willingness to acknowledge future challenges while committing to face them together demonstrated the kind of mature love that could weather difficulties rather than being destroyed by them. Her acceptance of his renewed commitment was measured and thoughtful rather than enthusiastic. "If you stay, it has to be because you want to build something lasting with me, not because you're afraid of being alone or because leaving feels too hard today. I need a partner who chooses this life because it's what he wants, not because it's what I need him to want. The conversation that followed was the most honest they'd ever shared, addressing not just immediate concerns, but long-term dreams, practical challenges, and the kind of relationship they both wanted to create. They discussed marriage not as romantic culmination, but as practical partnership children, not as abstract possibilities, but as real responsibilities they might choose to take on together. The breakthrough came when they realized that their crisis had forced them to articulate feelings and commitments they'd been afraid to examine too closely. Juan's near departure had revealed how much they both valued what they'd built together, while their honest discussion of fears and needs had created deeper understanding than months of careful courtship had achieved. Their decision to marry wasn't driven by passion or social pressure, but by genuine desire to formalize the partnership they'd already created through shared work and mutual respect. The ceremony they planned was simple and practical, focused on the commitment they were making to each other, rather than the celebration others might expect. Most importantly, they'd learned that lasting love required not just attraction and compatibility, but ongoing choice, the daily decision to prioritize their relationship over individual desires for independence or novelty. Their understanding that commitment meant choosing each other repeatedly rather than once created a foundation that could support whatever challenges frontier life might bring. The months that followed proved the wisdom of their decision to work through their crisis rather than avoid it through separation. Their marriage was stronger for having been tested, their understanding deeper for having been challenged. The winter they spent as husband and wife was marked not by the isolation Leora had feared, but by the comfortable intimacy of two people who'd chosen each other with full knowledge of the costs and benefits involved. Juan's restlessness, when it occasionally surfaced, became something they discussed and addressed together rather than a threat to their relationship. His commitment to their shared life was strengthened rather than weakened by honest acknowledgement that building lasting love required ongoing effort and conscious choice. The homestead they'd nearly lost to his departure became the foundation for a family that grew over the years, not just in size, but in the depth of connection and mutual support that proved their love had been worth the patience and courage required to build it slowly and carefully. Because sometimes the most beautiful love stories are those that survive the test of almost ending, proving that relationships built on choice rather than just chemistry can weather any storm and grow stronger through challenges that might destroy easier loves. The successful resolution of their crisis created a marriage that became a model for other couples in their frontier community, demonstrating that lasting relationships could be built on mutual respect and honest communication, rather than just romantic attraction. Their willingness to work through difficulties rather than avoid them through separation inspired other couples facing similar challenges with commitment and trust. Their homestead flourished under their joint management, becoming one of the most productive farms in the valley through their combination of Juan's technical skills and Leora's practical wisdom. Their success attracted other settlers to the area, creating a small community where their example of patient courtship and thoughtful marriage influenced how other couples approached relationships and family building. The agricultural innovations they developed through careful experimentation and cooperation proved valuable to other farming families throughout the territory. Their methods for soil improvement, crop rotation, and livestock management were shared freely, with neighbors contributing to the overall prosperity and sustainability of their region. Most importantly, their story proved that love built slowly and tested by adversity could create relationships strong enough to support not just individual happiness, but community development. Their commitment to each other extended naturally to commitment to their neighbors and their shared future in Montana territory. Juan and Leora's marriage produced 3 children who grew up understanding that healthy relationships required both independence and interdependence, that love meant choosing someone consistently, rather than just feeling attracted to them temporarily. Their family became known throughout the territory for their combination of individual strength and mutual support. Their son Illy and his siblings carried their parents' values into the next generation, creating marriages and families that continued the pattern of patient courtship, honest communication, and mutual respect that had characterized their parents' relationship. The impact of their example extended through their children's children, influencing family structures throughout the region for decades. The farming techniques and community development principles they pioneered influenced territorial and eventually state policies regarding homestead support and agricultural education. Their demonstration that cooperation created better outcomes than competition alone inspired programs that helped other settlers succeed in challenging frontier conditions. Their correspondence with friends and family in other territories spread their story throughout the American West, inspiring other couples to approach relationships with similar patience and intentionality. Their example influenced the development of more stable frontier communities by demonstrating that lasting marriages created stronger foundations for regional development than individual success alone. Juan discovered that commitment didn't limit his freedom, but enhanced it, providing the security and support that allowed him to take creative risks and pursue long-term dreams that wouldn't have been possible during his wandering years. His transformation from restless drifter to devoted husband and father proved that people could change fundamental aspects of their character when they found relationships worth the effort required. Leora learned that strength didn't require isolation, that accepting partnership actually increased her capability and resilience rather than diminishing them. Her evolution from solitary survivor to wife and mother demonstrated that vulnerability in relationships, when offered to trustworthy partners, created connections that enhanced rather than threatened individual identity. Their story proved that the most lasting love is built not on passion alone, but on the daily choice to honor commitments even when feelings fluctuate. The best relationships are those that grow slowly through consistent care and attention, weathering challenges that destroy connections based only on attraction or convenience, creating bonds that strengthen rather than weaken over time. The beautiful love story of Juan and Leora reminds us that true romance isn't about perfect moments, but about imperfect people choosing to build something beautiful together through patience, honesty, and the kind of commitment that survives difficult times. If you've been touched by this tale of love that grew slowly but lasted forever, subscribe to our channel for more stories that prove the most meaningful relationships are those built on respect, understanding, and the courage to choose each other every day. Click on the next video to discover another incredible story of frontier love that shows how the best partnerships are created when two people decide to grow together rather than simply fall together.